Hello and welcome to the new security perimeter, protecting identities and endpoints in the remote work age. I'm your host, Mike Vizard. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm going to remind you of some housekeeping up front. First of all, if you want to ask a question, there's a chat button up on the top right there. Feel free to ask a question at any point. We'll try to get to it at some point, or either at the end, maybe in the middle, depending on the nature of the question. Also, I would remind everybody that you are eligible for an American Express gift card, or an Amazon gift card, and there'll be 4 of those winners, so stay tuned to the end to see if you won. Today, we are joined by 3 people who are a lot smarter than I am, so let's get to it. Greg Keller is the CTO for JumpCloud. Greg, welcome. All right, and then we also have Eric Groce, who's the Incident Handler Manager for Red Canary. Eric, welcome to the show.
Excellent, thanks. Happy to be here.
And finally, we have Dr. Jim Trinan, who is the Senior Director of Engineering for VMware Carbon Black. Dr. Jim, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, thank you.
All right, let's jump into it and start with Eric. This whole COVID thing, we've been dealing with it for a while now. I'm sure that you have had quite a number of incidents and a few war stories that you may be willing to share or may not, depending on how sensitive they are. But my question to you is, it seems like everybody rushed out the door, got everybody working from home, and then we kind of just winged it from there and hopes for the best. So what's been your experience? Has it been good, bad, indifferent, getting better? And most importantly, what have you learned?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to those questions. I think some of it just starts with we realized real quick that some companies were kind of well prepared for this type of situation and others weren't so much. And usually the larger, more complex infrastructures that supported that employment base wasn't in place to kind of support a remote structure where there was kind of only smaller pockets, right, of the organization that may be working remotely. I think what we've seen from like a threat perspective as it kind of specifically relates to COVID situations is normally when you're kind of have an incident at a company, at an organization, you try to kind of trace it back to kind of that patient zero. You can look at all your logs, your intrusion detection devices, your firewalls, your endpoint data. You could kind of build that picture a lot quicker when everybody was in the same office. But all of a sudden everybody's home, and depending on the technology you have, you either have logs or you don't. Some of that's as simple as some companies had good endpoint security and then they go home and they still have good endpoint security. But some other companies, as soon as that goes out the door, they're kind of dependent on maybe like an Office 365 to check email. And maybe if someone were to use kind of traditional VPN technology, they might have some type of logging there depending on how the traffic flows. So I think just getting a kind of, okay, well, when we're all in one place, this is how we'd respond to incidents. Now that kind of goes out the door, right? So I think that's been the main thing. And obviously all the same stuff is still occurring. We're still seeing, threat actors attack companies. We're still seeing full ransomware compromises. Jim will speak to some of this a little bit later, but none of that has changed. If not, it's gotten a little bit worse. We have a large footprint in a lot of healthcare organizations, and as bad as it is, they're kind of one of the primary sources of companies being attacked right now, organizations that are being attacked. So take that as it is, but the threat actors aren't stupid, right? They know who to target, where they can get the most value from, and unfortunately, that's kind of what we're seeing.
Let me follow that up a little bit. A lot of these end users, did they have machines that were given to them by either you or by the organization that they work for? Or if they were unmanaged, did you push out agents to manage these things over time? Or how did you kind of cope with the fact that there was so many different types of machines that people suddenly wanted to use?
Yeah, so I think the main thing for us is like we help companies obviously manage their endpoint security. So the step one was, okay, you have this product. How confident are you that you're deployed everywhere, right? Whether it's Red Canary or another kind of security provider. And that was a problem in and of itself, especially when people, one day you're in the office, the next day all the orders came down and you couldn't go to the office. So some of this stuff had to be pushed remotely. Then you realize you can't push some of the stuff remotely. So I think a lot of it was just employee laptops, right? That they had sitting on their desks. They just closed it, went home, and just never came back. Now, the other tricky thing is a lot of organizations, because they might have been in-person heavy, a lot of those users might have had desktops that were fairly secure and the policies were done really well. But then all of a sudden, on the fly, that same employee requests a laptop that may not have the latest patches or may not have the latest updates to it, but they need it now. So just, it was a lot of chasing and following up kind of post-COVID, when it was kind of in the thick of it and everybody was at home.
Hey, Greg, I want to get your thoughts on where are we, do you think, as a industry when it comes to remote support right now? In my experience, maybe most organizations had, maybe 10% of their employees were working from home, and now we're going to have 80%, and we may go back to the office, but we're going to have 50%, and there's going to be a lot of fluidity. People typically relied on a VPN to access some local office, and then all the traffic got backhauled. But now we have all these cloud applications. So what's your opinion of where are we? Are we about to see a fundamental shift in networking architectures, and what might that look like? And how big or complicated an effort is that going to be?
I think we are in the early days. I'm going to corroborate pretty much everything that Eric said, because it's relevant, Mike, to your question, in that there was a very clear distinction. When COVID hit, we deployed our workforce, about just under 300 people, and we deployed roughly March 13th, and everybody, it was overnight. We flipped the switch, and generally speaking, it was seamless. But we don't look like a lot of companies that Eric described, which are longer in the tooth, large employee workforces, lots of traditional on-premise architecture, IT architecture, I should say. So the early days for the enterprise is here, right? I think there's going to be a cacophony of vendors that have to kind of assemble themselves to make a person who now is at home in what would be referred to as an untrusted environment, meaning your home network router, your ISP, et cetera, and making it feel from a security perspective and posture that person is inside the corporate domain. And it's way beyond just the simplistic view of, well, VPN is going to solve that. It's clearly not going to solve that for many reasons. I think a couple of things. One, if your audience here has not sort of started to flip the chapters of the zero trust security architecture model, they'd be well justified in the time to begin their research to do that and understand the components of what it's like to, frankly, have your employees live and work. Frankly, I know this is a term that we use a lot, but like have them work in a domainless enterprise, right? Where there are no brick and mortar buildings, they're not walking in and key carding in, where everything the IT team has done for millennia has sort of been to secure the inside perimeter. Zero trust, trusting the device. Everybody on this panel is very intimate with the jobs that are required to secure an endpoint and make sure that endpoint can travel with the employee anywhere on earth, virtually stretching the corporate's domain to wherever that person is with their trusted device. So that is absolutely critical. I think the other very interesting aspect to all this, and really what we saw created that record scratch moment for many of our IT folks when COVID hit, was, these companies were doing well. COVID didn't necessarily affect them. They had hiring plans. And now their traditional IT tooling and how they did their business required like physically, getting access to those laptops, Windows laptops from Dell, Apple laptops from DEP, whatever, may be required, or from Best Buy for that matter. They'd configure it. They would physically hand it, to their brand new employee with a sticky, and they'd, welcome to the company, let's help you bootstrap. How do you do that now when it's verboten? You can't come to an office. So getting used to the cadence of how do we deploy what is, a trusted device, bootstrap it, make sure it's omni-secure, get things on it, so I don't have a chicken and egg scenario. Yeah, employee, I know you can't come into a real office. You're brand new. It's a pandemic. Why don't you go down to Best Buy and buy a laptop and we'll reimburse you? That's not acceptable still, right? So getting in front of, zero-touch deployment models where the Carbon Blacks and the Red Canaries and the JumpClouds of the world can be on a device as it is manufactured and delivered, like that is really where I think, a lot of innovation is going to occur in the coming, certainly, now that real near normal,
Well, let me ask you as a follow-up to that. You mentioned zero trust architectures, and it's a buzzword that we hear, but I think maybe at the simplest terms, we're going to manage based on identity, and if we do that as kind of the core atomic unit of networking and security, it then becomes possible to know who's on what network, accessing what applications. What is the challenge in kind of getting to that?
I think it is, in large part, while Zero Trust or Beyond Corp, if you follow Google's similar analog model to this, very progressive and enables free-floating, users to be trusted, wherever they are. You can very much see in those architectural diagrams, they're still looking at vestiges of the past on-premise radius servers, on-premise access control proxies, like all these kinds of things are becoming brittle and antiquated, right? I think, if you step back, Mike, when we look at the problem space, for, the early days, it was all about the network perimeter. Okay, cool. And then it blossomed with, okay, how do we secure devices, antivirus, all these kinds of things, still critical to this day. The next phase of what we're witnessing is sort of like, think of the world's simplest Venn diagram, merging the world of device and identity, right? And all of what it takes to secure that environment so that when the employee logs in, that they're asserted, they're safe, all the work that Jim's team is doing and Eric's teams and our teams, we're creating this enveloped secure environment for the employee so that when they go and fetch resources, wherever they are, back in the office, up in the cloud, wherever, we know that that device from that location with a trusted user, with a trusted posture is going to be okay. They're not, it's a secure transaction. Like that's the next generation, and all these things are converging to make that a reality.
Okay. Hey, Jim, in my experience, security has always been an afterthought. I'd love to say at some point we would be at the forefront of that and putting security, before the horse, as it were. But as far as I can tell, once again, we're chasing after things. Everybody rushed out the door. We didn't really have a great security plan, and now we're hoping for the best. So what are you seeing from people as they try to catch up on the security side of this work from home equation?
Yeah, it's definitely mixed. We've seen varying degrees of preparedness. Like we're lucky in the larger companies or some of the younger companies were used to working from home. So the machines in a lot of ways were portable. They were already pre-configured with good security. But we also saw a lot of the problems where there's larger companies that were not set up with something as simple as two-factor auth, let alone a strong sense of identity. And so, going back to what Greg said, if we're procuring machines for a now mobile workforce, that's only one piece of the equation. We're seeing where there were companies that weren't even set up to allow them to remotely authenticate for the vast majority of their employers, right? And once we solve that problem, then we're back to the perimeter that we have now is our device. Like if you solve the identity problem, that's one thing. But as we've looked at the attack trends over the last 6 months, we've seen a drastic uptick in just OS vulnerability exploits from a number of vectors, right? There's still holes in the operating systems of all the devices that we use. I mean, we are getting much better at securing them, but if you take somebody and they're using their machine, for example, to create these secure transactions going back to, as Greg said, either the cloud or back into a data center, that's one thing. But once the data becomes resident on your laptop or your phone or your tablet or whatever, there's a different attack vector to come in and steal it. Even if you're working on a zero trust architecture, if the data remains resident, we're seeing, really like old school simple attacks all the way up to super targeted sophisticated attacks that are always going to go after, how do I compromise that data? If the transaction's secure, but the data's sitting on my laptop, for example, and I happen to open a phishing email, or I get hit with something more sophisticated, the end goal is always that data extraction, and there's still a possibility of that happen. So there's definitely varying degrees of preparedness for that, but we're still scrambling to be sure.
I want to, Mike, let me just absolutely corroborate what Jim is saying here. When I step back, email is the linchpin to your security battle space. It really is, like compromised accounts and the untold amount. Every one of us have, as a software vendor in the cloud, have some mechanism to send a user an email, they confirm or verify their account or whatever, right? There's almost like, there has been historically no pattern way out of it, because email is so integral to the way businesses do business. Mm-hmm. Let me give some props for a second to the original Microsoft team that did domain control services in after WinNT, like when Windows Server 2000 came out. That was the spark, like Kerberos. And if you really grok the elegance of a Windows operating system against their own kind of domain empire, this is like, when you have a brick and mortar domain and all that kind of stuff, and let the computer change your password, let the computer assert your identity. Like, they did things right back in the day, but everything has changed. And I'm still struggling with, why are we sending emails? Listen, my platform sends emails too, but put the work back on the safe, secure environment of the machine. I mean, that is like, there's so much goodness with, we've done so much work as an industry to basically put a tiny little moat around these endpoints, right? Our MacBooks, our Windows Surface laptops, or whatever. And it still blows me away that we have to rely upon these antiquated means like email, I digress. Thank you, Mike, for letting me rant just for a second. Back to you.
All right. One more nail in the email coffin, as it were. Jim, to this point, though, we were moving down this path towards EDR and kind of away from AV software for a while. Do you think that that's been accelerated as part of this push? Are people starting to say, you know what, the existing ways we're managing security don't really work? And so and what is the challenge in making that transition? And then how big an effort is it?
Yeah, I tend to think of this, and this is the way we think about it at Carbon Black as a whole, is it really has to be multi-tiered, right? Like, going back, I'm not going to say we're not going to get rid of antivirus, right? There's value there, but we want to build layers up, starting at the core of like the simplest detect a bad file, even if it's signature based, to something that's more advanced, looking at the structure of the file or how it executes to stop it. We want to make that decision as early as we possibly can. Sometimes we can't make that decision in a split second, so it takes longer. So we have things like behavioral detection and watching the way the executions would happen, for example, on my Mac or a Windows machine or any other operating system, a Linux server. But getting to your point about EDR and what Eric said earlier about the logs going away, like I really feel sorry for incident responders right now when you're operating completely outside of the environment. The only hope you have there is something like an EDR solution where we're actually collecting the logs and hopefully shipping them back to like a cloud-based service or a central server, depending on how you've got it built. Sometimes that gets wiped out, but I really think it takes all of that, because we are still seeing, like, we've seen an uptick in every type of attack, from commodity phishing type stuff, usually definitely exacerbated by exploiting people's fear, like click here for the latest COVID map or whatever, and doing it that way, all the way up to very, very sophisticated APT41 type attacks where they're being very, very targeted. You have to have multiple layers of defense, whether it's, we're not talking defense in depth in the old school sort of concentric circles and a perimeter anymore. It's really focused on, how do I get as much as I can on this little endpoint or a device? How can I authenticate the users? But then also knowing that there's other ways to get in, like I talked about, stealing the data coming in through a side door. We want to protect against all of that, and it really depends. Like, there's some companies that are very advanced at deploying that. You know, I work for Carbon Black, so clearly I have all those different tools on my machine, but there's a lot of companies for either, you know, lack of sophistication or lack of skills, or just, you know, not prioritizing. They're not even close. And what we're seeing there, I'm sure Eric, you see this too, is people that don't even know that they've been breached until something egregious like ransomware happens. The environment locks up and they come in and look and see how bad it's really gotten.
And these attacks, Jim, they're not very sophisticated. I know we talk about all this amazing security technology we have at our disposal, but it seems like for the most part, we continue to fall victim to your basic phishing campaign through an email. And, you know, that may be at the root of why Greg wants to kill email. But,
at the end of the day, hackers, they're very smart and very motivated, but they're also lazy, right? They're going to take the path of least resistance. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've seen an uptick in things like, you know, macros and VBA scripts popping out of Word documents. You know, this is something that we kind of nipped in the bud 10 years ago. And now, you know, as people have stopped watching it so much and the tooling is focused on other things, this has become an attack vector that we've seen a dramatic uptick, right? And, you know, it's, my wife always says, like, if you get an email that says like cute puppy, don't click on it, right? Because that's the #1 attack vector. If you layer in COVID over the top of that, everybody there's this thirst for knowledge around what's the attack trends, what's it like in my state or my neighborhood or global, whatever. Like, you put that, people are going to click without thinking. You get that email, especially if it's masquerading from a government agency or somebody that you think you trust, you're highly incented to click it because you're scared. It looks like it came from whoever, the federal government or, you know, the World Health Organization. You inherently sort of trust it. Nobody's going to look to see what it actually looks like. You click, pop, you know, it drops something, you know, simple, downloads a payload, and we're off to the races, right? And it works. We see it over and over and over again.
Right. An injury report about one of the players on my favorite team would definitely get me to click on something.
Right. Yeah.
I think
All right.
all of us, like, I don't know what it's like, Jim or Eric or Mike, for you, like, you know, clearly we're all in our homes, which is cool, and we're safe. We have all become IT administrators for our households.
For sure.
And I can't stress to you enough now that, you know, Jim is correct. Like, you know, executives like us get attacked. They're looking for our personal information, which is usually a secondary email to my corporate kind of, you know, backdoor. There's so many sophisticated deep faking attacks that are going on. Our jobs at home are ensuring that I'm not, oh, you know what, here's my son's Windows gaming laptop. It's next to me. It's super convenient. I just need to get on my Gmail. And this thing is riddled with Russian malware or whatever, right? We need, you know, as now corporate citizens in our own homes, we have to really wonder, what's my home router like? Who's slurping that data? Like, what machines can I and should I trust to get access, you know, when I'm accessing my sensitive corporate stuff, right? So the sensitivities that, you know, what we're doing is teaching our employees what it's like to manage your home like our own IT staff does. It's been quite remarkable. Like, everybody is like, you know, much higher posture.
I have an assistant IT director. He's 10. He's in charge of Zoom, all those things from school. So that's working out pretty good. Eric, let me ask you something. Do you think that this whole shift will finally drive us further down the path of IT automation? I know we've been talking about it forever and a day, but you guys manage at scale, and I'm imagining that things are fairly automated already. But I feel like a lot of organizations didn't really push that as aggressively as they might have in the past because of either people were worried about their jobs or they just had simple inertia or whatever it is going to be. But, you know, are we on the cusp of some moment in time here where people are going to say, hey, it's complex. There's a lot of stuff flying around. There's a lot of people. I don't have the resources I used to have in a downturn. So, you know, are we about to make some kind of great leap forward on automation?
Yeah, I think the only way that automation was going to become very much a thing in corporate America was for us to be pushed to that, not willy-nilly, yeah, let's do this great thing, right? So I think, obviously, I'll keep bringing up COVID. COVID, I think, pushed that, but more so, I think just the daily workflow of the average employee, right, is, let's say me and Jim were in the same office, and, oh, I need Jim to sign this purchase order, just walk over to his desk and he signs it, right? Well, why am I wasting time, or I can't even do that anymore when Jim is 600 miles away or let's say he's moved or he's on the other side of town now. Why don't I just automate that process? Jim gets done with his work, he submits it. I get done with mine and I submit it, and it happens on the back end, and we let computers do what computers are really good at, right? I think that's what a lot of people are realizing as we've become so dependent on our sole laptop at home is, man, this thing can do a lot for me. I don't have to be sitting around on my coworkers do the same type of work. It can do this, or maybe it shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. So I think the ways that you can wiggle automation into those kind of those boundaries, I think will significantly increase companies' kind of scale. Because I think we're realizing everybody's dispersed now. Companies are trying to survive. Some companies are trying to even grow, and some companies have experienced exponential growth, right? All trying to figure out, like, do we need to hire back our employee base? Can all this stuff be done with automation? So I think finally we're getting to the point where we're asking those questions, and they're really meaningful questions because there is some kind of positive outcomes from those answers. So
somebody's digital business project is now their business continuity plan, right? So they're kind of trying to move all that stuff forward and say, hey, this is how we're going to operate. Have you seen companies that you do business with say, hey, we're not coming back to the office. We don't need an office, and maybe we're just going to turn everybody's home into their new branch office and try to manage it that way? Or do you think that's a small number of cases?
Yeah, I think I've seen a little bit of both. And it's funny, when we talk about not going back in the office, I don't think it's so much that, I mean, sure, it's cost is related, like maybe, oh, we've been fine, we don't need to kind of continue to rent or lease that office space. But I think some of it is, I have to go through a checklist of 200 things so my employees can actually be in an office to meet the local regulations of, business being open during the times of COVID. I think a lot of companies like, I don't even want to go through all that. We're doing fine. Let's wait till, the world gets a little bit healthier. So we for sure have seen that. I think there's always going to be a place for office, right? Especially for things like sales, leadership, engineering type of roles. But for things like customer service or, support, 90% of that stuff happens with a phone call or email, to Greg's point. But you don't need to be in an office for that, right? So it's kind of what I've been seeing.
All right, we'll see what happens. I think people will be floating between offices back and forth for a while, and then organizations may get more comfortable and decide that, hey, perhaps I don't need that train ride or 2-hour drive to work every day and back and forth. Greg, I want to ask you, as you think about what the architecture of networking and security is going to look like going forward, do you think people need to think through how they're going to deliver and make available applications across those architectures? And will that change as well? Because it seems to me, if people are on home networks, latency becomes a bigger issue. You got to figure that out. You got to then figure out, is the application going to run in the cloud, or am I going to deploy it in a local data center? So what are some of the nuances down the road that IT folks should be thinking through on the application side as they think about these new networking and security architectures?
Let me just touch on, the cloud, or, applications and, services, et cetera, take many forms. Some have to be on-premise, some have new sort of versions of them that are cloud-born. So, regardless, I think the first, thing that if I'm an IT person or I am a driver in the business that needs to acquire a piece of software, IT's first kind of thing is, what is my authentication scheme for this? And that, I quite honestly will immediately make the IT person go left or right. Meaning, if I can't necessarily use a modern protocol, SAML, skimmed for provisioning, variants like that, then life is going to be very difficult to network and tunnel through to make that application safe if it has to be behind a firewall. It's done every day. Do not get me wrong. Very sophisticated networking architectures are born by probably many people in this audience. The problem is it is incredibly complex and often not necessary, right? So I think, that's sort of the first thing that we're seeing. at a larger scale, you know, again, humor me for posturing, but many of these vendors have to start, security for them is a premium thing. And I think they're doing their customer base a disservice, meaning, you know, to get security features like authentication via SAML is this incredibly elaborate, expensive thing, right? And I think we all need to look around and help each other by saying, you know what, times have changed. Security is of the utmost important. We're all protecting, you know, ourselves from the bad guys. So when making those types of purchasing decisions, I would really carefully look at vendors that kind of do that gate that kind of, you know, stuff. I'm not talking about security vendors here. I'm just talking about an application like that you would like to subscribe to on the internet, right? So those are things that, you know, when we are talking with customers, which we do every day, I try and get on at least once a day with a customer or a prospect. These are the real challenges. You know, it's like, I don't know, it's very expensive. We can't afford all that stuff. So again, it's a different way of coming at answering you, Mike, but it's purely based on the observations we're seeing.
All right, Jim, let's follow up on that. So if universal healthcare is a human right, then Greg is saying universal security is sort of a human right or an IT right. So how do I make security more affordable and practical for people? And, you know, what are you guys thinking about here?
I think just kind of extending the theme that Greg just talked about with, let's talk about hosted apps for a minute, right? You know, the second thing that we see after OS vulnerabilities for uptick is actually web hosted apps during the whole COVID crisis, right? And the way that we make it more accessible to people is I think we just have to say that any vendor who's going to be taken seriously has to build this in, right? And it needs to be done in an open and simple way, right? It needs to not be super cumbersome. We need to have, we go through this all the time, you know, being a vendor, we go through audits from especially large customers that want to come in and talk about our life, you know, our SDLC, right? Like, how do we build software? How do we bake this in? You know, they're becoming effectively we're becoming an extension of their enterprise, right? So if we get compromised, there's, you know, what we call an island hopping attack, where if we get compromised, they could become compromised, right? And so it's becoming a lot more of a shared risk model because of the way that the enterprise is breaking down. You know, we're going away from having to worry about building a wall and a moat around our data center to having to worry about the security posture of everybody that we do business with. And I think collectively, we just have to say, you know, that has to go from being an afterthought to being baked into the very beginning of the software development lifecycle, that when we build systems, they're open using modern standards, right? That we're not trying to build these walled gardens, that we are adhering from the beginning to best practices so that we can help, you know, as our perimeter becomes increasingly nebulous, like never mind my laptop, but all the different services that I'm connected to right now. If I was to look at my TCP stack to say, who all am I talking to? We have to make sure that not only is the transaction secure, but their environment is secure, because it's oftentimes easier for them to breach my data on the back end of somebody I do business with than it is to steal it from my laptop. Right. And so we're seeing this, the way we build software, the way that we ask our partners to build software, this has to just become the new norm.
So there's a lot of focus on the software supply chain and a lot of talk about things like DevSecOps. Do you think that we're going to meld together the application development and the security process better than we have in the past, or what will be required to achieve that?
It's highly variable, right? And, you know, some people, like, we're a security vendor, so we take it, you know, we've probably led that charge, right? Because we're incented by virtue of the type of software that we build, that we pull it way forward in our SDLC, right? And we're a very DevSecOps oriented culture, but that was a transformation, right? That's something that we've had to get our mind wrapped around over the last few years, especially as we move from being an on-prem software provider to, you know, having our business hosted in the cloud. It's a different mindset, right? And I think there's a great, you know, disparity in different vendors' mindsets around that. Some, you know, some are very good at it, some of them are not, but we have to get there, especially if you're going to be running hosted apps, right? I mean, it's the days of being able to, this is questionable whether you could in the beginning, but rely on firewalls and things to keep the bad guys out. It's just a whole different world, and we have to do it. To answer your question, have we done it yet? I think it's nascent, right? But I think it's absolutely critical. It's not an option that we don't do it.
All right. Eric, a lot of the people watching this are IT professionals themselves, and you're a managed service provider, and there's always been a natural tension between internal IT and managed service providers. So, but in my experience, at least, every time there's a downturn, the interest in managed services goes up because people are a little shorthanded and they figure out that it's a little complex. And I'm wondering, have you seen an uptick in interest for managed services, and what kinds of conversations are you having with people about where the internal IT team may fit with the managed service provider?
Yeah, I think some of that goes back to the principle of like, as a company, you need to focus on what you're really good at. As an IT professional, focus what you're really good at, and then partner with everything else that you're not, right? So I have seen that for sure. Where, in my world, security, the stakes are extremely high, especially if we're talking about a healthcare organization in the middle of COVID and their emergency room gets shut down because they got hit with a ransomware attack. I think that's where the light bulb goes off with IT/security to say, okay, this isn't a joke anymore. We can't kind of skate along. Let me go find a partner that knows how to do this really well, or find products that can do this really well, and kind of fully incorporate that into our IT infrastructure. I think something else that helps there is when you're approaching an organization and they're kind of hesitant to work with you. One thing that helps kind of make that a little bit more subtle or easier to discuss and hopefully in the future become a partner with them is, oh, I already have XYZ product. Can you integrate with that? Or I'm committed to this product for the next on this 4-year cycle. Do you work with that at all? So I think as vendors, we just need to be open to working with not the competition necessarily, but other parallel technologies that we know are popular in the marketplace. Because if you kind of silo yourself as a software provider or as a service provider, it's going to be that battle is going to be much more challenging. That's just what I've seen on the front lines as far as having these very critical discussions in times of need. There's still considerations because let's face it, they have to live with your product after the paper signed. So what does that look like? I think is what they're really trying to answer.
Greg, are you doing anything on your side with vendors and the community in general to make it easier to consume IT as a service? What do you think? Where are we in that evolution, and how far can we go?
Are you asking if JumpCloud is, or if like just
if JumpCloud, or if the vendors that you partner with are coming together and kind of saying, hey, we got to find ways to lower the bar between some of the boundaries between applications and services and things like that.
Got it. Okay. There's like two kind of main big tectonic things that, in fact, this kind of dovetails in what Eric was saying. One is like protocols. They've been around for ages, but there's a whole swath of modern bridging protocols, especially in the identity space, that help our job as vendors or purveyors of identity solutions to shuttle securely information in between systems of record. It could be an HR system and a directory and a SSO tool, an and an MDM or an RMM. They're all contiguous, like when it really comes down to it. So the work we do, and the good news is many of the vendors in our space, we all really heavily work hard at contributing towards adding these protocols to our solutions. SCIM, SCIM, SAML, even protocols as old as LDAP and Radius. They're still ironclad, and we keep them updated and fresh, and now virtualized and cloud-born, stuff like that. The other tectonic plate is just obscene amounts of evangelism. So what we're finding and what we are contributing to is just open forums. There are no secrets anymore, meaning we shouldn't harbor how to best secure the posture of an employee or device or company at large. So contributing like we're doing, and I know both Jim and Eric's teams both do this extensively in various, open security and IT Slack forums, Spiceworks. Like we've hired people, that is their job. And in fact, they're former sysadmins whom we've hired to do that. To not talk about our vendor stuff, just contribute, just keep contributing, right? And I think that's the only way we can finally elevate to these siloed, or I should say these formally siloed approaches where the vendor has to be in utter control of everything, to a much more collaborative, good citizenry kind of model that we're much more appreciative of.
Do you think, I'm going to take one of the questions from the audience here because I find it kind of interesting than what we were talking about. Do you think we're going to evolve or move towards this notion of a digital workspace where instead of me just logging into a bunch of applications, I have this entire workspace that follows me around, and kind of I use it from home, I use it in the office? Greg, I think you were kind of talking about this question, but maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on your vision for what something called the digital workspace might look like.
I'll try and assemble some cohesive thoughts on that, because it's I have certainly my opinions on them, but let me go like a level of abstraction higher. I think if you look at all the major big vendors, and by that I'm not just talking about IT, but Google, Facebook, even Workday, I would assume, just watching some of Salesforce moves, like what are those things? These are huge, again, tectonic platforms, the biggest, parts of the IT space owned by these folks. They all want to own identity, right? They all have their different kinds of mechanisms of thinking about it and what their vectors are. First of all, do they collaborate between Office and my personal life? The second is, is this really about the browser or the device? The third is, do we really care about traditional on-premise stuff? This is about the cloud. So there's just this complete, sort of fractured makeup, and there's certainly no cohesion on it. So that's the as-is state, right? At least, we could unpack that in an entirely separate webinar just on those kinds of philosophies. The digital workspace, though, is not a new, or it's not a, sort of a new concept. I mean, many folks have tried their hand at this, from the late 90s portals to, device manufacturers trying to get clever about, their operating systems, and so on. I think what it feels like, it goes back to my statement before of truly intertwining the device, the safety and the sanctity of the device, and who has logged in. And once that has occurred, that is your quite literally your workspace. And that machine, because it knows you, needs to tell the rest of the world's resources, I am safe. You may allow this person to go and finish their transaction. Now, when you really unpack that, we're back to protocols. We're back to the secure transactions. We're back to, you can't have a proprietary set of these pipes, right? So we have to really start to look at, again, protocols, WebAuthn, how to, SAML, how do the confluence of those things express themselves from devices that are trusted out to wherever the resource lives. I mean, the workspace becomes the thing that you're on and know how to utilize effectively. But, some may call that short-sighted. Others may think, yeah, I mean, that's the actual horizon is that right now.
All right. I think digital workspaces is going to be one of those things where you'll know it when you see it, but when you see it, you'll be like, where's it been all my life?
Yeah.
Jim, I want to ask you something. I'm getting a bunch of questions here about, is this thing more secure than that thing, whether it's an operating system or a virtual machine, or, I think today the latest thing is, containers are more secure than something else. So my question is, is anything secure, or should I kind of just figure out the fact that, things are differently insecure, and I should figure out how to kind of maybe approach this a little more holistically than worrying about which individual piece of a stack might be more secure than another?
Yeah, I mean, I prefer to have the conversation around the ladder, right? It's very difficult to get into what's more secure. I mean, what's more secure today can have an O day in it tomorrow, and that's the end of that, right? And so, I mean, there's certainly trends, right, that people can look at, but at the end of the day, we still subscribe to the assume breach. You know, we take a holistic approach to this, build in multiple layers of detention, of defense, try to limit the blast radius if there is some sort of breach, like getting into this zero trust world where if my endpoint gets breached, hopefully we can shut it down and the blast radius of the damage is as small as it can possibly be, right? I think, you know, we're all in this together, and we're trying, you know, we work with the OS vendors very directly, as every endpoint security person does. But at the end of the day, there's always something. I mean, we see coming out regardless of whether it's Mac, Linux, or Windows, iOS, you know, Android. These things pop up, right? And so rather than getting mired down into the debate around who's more, in quotes, secure, it's really, we should assume that there's a way to get in. We need to approach it way more holistically. Like, I love the idea of having, you know, secure transactions, like strong identity with strong transactional trust and all of that, to try to lock it down as much as we can. Because at the end of the day, regardless of, you know, if I'm on a Mac or a Windows machine, I'm communicating with a million different people, going back to the whole notion of a supply chain attack. Or, you know, if it's not me, and because I'm using some version of an operating system today, it could be the person that I'm talking to, or like Craig said, my daughter's laptop that's sitting next to me that's unpatched. It's much more, I think, important to put on that holistic mindset and say, okay, how do we assume, you know, lack of trust, assume that there's going to be a breach, and then limit the effects of that to the extent possible, is a much more productive conversation.
Okay. Hey, Greg, I want to ask you about a phrase you kind of tossed around, but I don't know if you got into it with the level of depth that you might want it, but software-defined perimeter. I mean, I talked to some folks and they're like, well, yeah, that means, you know, we're getting rid of appliances and we're just getting rid of our firewall. Or is it more elaborate than that? And what exactly does the software-defined perimeter is? And by the way, if we're all working from home, is there a perimeter at all?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the zero trust stuff, but let's just let's pretend a pandemic isn't here. There was and still is a huge amount of investment capital and innovation going on in the, you know, SD-WAN space. And you know, I'm not naming vendors here, but those that are leveraging data intel to make informed decisions on access control within networks themselves, I think are finding themselves in a phenomenal position. There's a lot of M&A activity, or there was pre-COVID in this space. So personally, it's here to stay. You watch the moves that the big players are making, Juniper, Cisco, and you know, if we assume that we do in some semblance get back to offices, you know, that will be an amazing place to be. Now, in the pandemic, we have a much different problem. Home offices, untrusted networks, all the stuff we've been talking about for 45 minutes. And I think now this has been the forcing function to really expose the criticality of what, you know, Jim, Eric, and JumpCloud, in my case, all of our specific companies that employ us, you know, what has been very critical. It is, you know, data intel, it's protective services, it's making the environment that the person is computing on outside of a brick and mortar domain fortified, right? So I don't know. You know, that in and of itself is its own big category, but that's what we're seeing. Our customers are directly asking us how they can augment their model into leveraging software to help them feel like they're as secure as they are in a hardware or otherwise network, you know, perimeter controlled environment in a brick and mortar building. Every day we're getting asked this.
I think I heard you say clean up in the appliance aisle, but let's see what happens. All right.
Yep.
Eric, you see customers all the time and they come and they engage you, and I would love to know what it is, you know, if you had your perfect wish list when a customer shows up, what would they look like? What would they have? How, you know, how much capability would they have? And what's your best advice to them to kind of prepare to be part of something that's a larger managed service environment?
Yeah, so just like from a tooling or just process perspective, so the first thing that comes to mind is like a complete curveball to start to answer your question, but I always like organizations that come and there's an executive level leadership or someone who directly reports to them on that call. And I only say that because when we're talking about preparedness and ability to kind of be prepared for this world of attackers and kind of everything that comes along with that, is it starts with the top and runs down from there. Very, very rare will you catch someone in the support desk saying we need better security and the whole company changes, right? So I think that's kind of the first thing that like I like to see right out of the gate. The other thing, this doesn't get mentioned enough, but is just assets. What do you own? Where are they? How many of them do you have? Is nearly not impossible, but I come across very few organizations that can do that really well. And it's kind of like we do this in our daily lives really well. We always know where our kids are. We know where our cars are. We know where the stuff we own. We lended that out to that friend, or that friend owes me $50. But when we come to our organizations, it's I think we have 1,000 laptops, but it's really 1,650. So I always like to see some type of good asset inventory. And then the kind of last bit, and we see compromise all the time, is what do I have that's external facing? So Jim mentioned web app attacks. I see it himself and myself. We see a ton of, oh, I didn't realize it had remote desktop sitting on the internet.
Yeah.
Boom, that's how the attacker got in, and it was just one failed firewall and one failed rule later, and the whole company's kind of compromised. So again, it's just a lot of security just comes down to awareness. I always think like I'm traveling, I get off the plane out of the airport, and you walk out of the airport and it's like, oh, where am I? I've never been here before. You're a little nervous, but you find a car rental place, you get in your car, and it's a little bit safer already, right? So like, I think the more aware you are, the more kind of educated you are about your corporate infrastructure is just hands down, because the first thing that an incident responder is going to do, or even a partner like JumpCloud or a partner like Carbon Black is going to do, is like, tell me more about your organization. How many users do you have? How many people are logging in? What's that software? How many endpoints? And more often than not, a lot of organizations just don't have those answers, and then it makes it much harder for any of us on the phone to assist with that. So.
You guys ever say no to a customer and say, hey, we'd like to help you out, but it's just too complicated and too hard and the gear's too old?
I'll vehemently say no on that one, just because with Red Canary, and I'm sure JumpCloud and Carbon Black, you never want to leave anybody hanging. Jim said it a while ago, we're all in this together. So whether you're in complete disarray or you're a well-polished organization, I think the more secure we all are, the tougher it is for attackers in general, or the tougher it is for people to compromise credentials. So I think about like, man, the more people that have kind of partnered with JumpCloud, the less likely XYZ attacks are to occur. And same thing with Carbon Black. So that's how I kind of look at things.
All right, Jim, I want to get your advice here. So short of maybe, giving a mask to every endpoint that we have out there to maybe enhance security somehow or other, but what is the thing that organizations should be doing today to make their environments more secure? What's the thing that's most often overlooked? And short of coming and hanging out on the website for VMware Carbon Black, which I'm sure you guys would love, but what is the thing that you would say to them, hey, if you're really going to be serious about this, you need to start here and start thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, I mean, just basic IT hygiene is really the starting point. Like you asked, do we ever say no to a customer? We don't, but we do get a lot of shocked eyes when we start putting eyes on environments, right? Like whether it's lack of configuration, RDP on the internet, which we see all the time, machines that haven't been patched or running archaic versions of operating systems, or ancient versions of frameworks for the web app. Like we've all heard these stories a million times, right? And so number one is always basic IT hygiene, right? Like how do we keep things patched, in a meaningful and quick way? The second one is, education around just phishing and things. Like I get phished all the time. I'm sure everybody on the call does. There's been times that I've almost clicked, right? And, I'm trained, I do this for a living, but, training people around, here's the attack vector that's most common is it's going to come to you via your email. And then after that, you start layering in like, what are the tools that we use to protect the endpoint, right? How do we enforce strong identity? How do we, look at the network? But there's things that are kind of table stakes that a lot of companies aren't good at, and that's where we would like to start.
Do you think we need to spend more time on training users?
Mike, 3
ahead.
letters, MFA. Everything Jim said plus MFA.
Yes,
Please do it.
absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you though, do you think we need to spend more time training end users to be part of this security conversation? Are they part of the frontline defense, or is it just too much to ask?
I think we need to train. I mean, some companies do this, right? And I think your mileage may vary on the training, right? But like, I'm a believer in it, like getting awareness. People don't know this. We're security professionals. We sort of grok it because we've been doing it forever. But, the basic amount of training can really help, because some of these attack vectors, again, it's like, as much as we like to think of the highly trained hacker, sitting in a lab somewhere, a lot of times it's a lot more straightforward, and the most basic compromises can be avoided with just a little bit of cluing people in.
All right, Greg, same question to you. What's your best advice to folks, given the totality of the thing? We've talked about networking, security, applications. It's the whole gamut, end to end. And frankly, it can be a little overwhelming. So how do I think about all this in a way that I can get started and do something meaningful that has a path behind it?
Jim nailed it, so I won't belabor it in some unnecessarily long diatribe. You get back to pure basics. One, do the best that we can to inventory who is in our company. You'll find very quickly, dormant accounts, user accounts on Linux hosts that shouldn't be there. Just, from purely a human or service account perspective, what exists, what's real, what can be terminated or otherwise shut down. The second is, I would say, just while this is, again, arcane, but we all live with it, get into a cadence of proper password health. So that is a 2-part thing. One, you should really be following NIST standards. Passwords like password 123, any resource that you have shouldn't even honor that anymore. They should be long elongated phrases that only you know, and couple that with multi-factor authentication, and you have just a baseline to then get into more sophisticated armoring of your enterprise. You have to start with the basics.
All right, everybody concentrate on the fundamentals. I want to thank our speakers for sharing their knowledge today, and I also want to read out who won the Amazon card winners. Congratulations to Francis M., James V., Keith W., and Sarah R. Anybody got one last thing that they want to say with 3 minutes left to go that we did not touch on that feels like it's super critical?
Yeah, I'll just give just a couple seconds here. Is one thing I think every company needs to have is to sit down and just come up with a basic incident response plan. So if, however you want to phrase those words, things do go south, what are like the 5 or 6 steps you're going to take? It can be real simple, doesn't have to be complicated, but I would highly encourage you kind of jump on a meeting after this webinar and start to figure that stuff out.
All right, guys, you heard it here first. Concentrate on the fundamentals. Stay away from those shiny little objects everywhere. All right. All right, guys, thanks for everything, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.